Welcome to an exciting edition of Rebellion's educational series. We have a legendary astronaut with us, Tom Jones, someone who's seen space and has experienced what most of us can only dream about. Astronaut Jones, thank you so much for coming on today.
You're welcome, Alex. Good to be with you. Looking forward to our conversation about space and asteroids and all things of interest to you.
So how worried are you about an asteroid collision with the Earth? Is that something that keeps you up at nights? Is this something that we should all be very worried about?
I would not say very worried, but it's good to be prudent about it. So my interest in this whole topic of protecting planet Earth from an asteroid strike comes from my work as an asteroid scientist when I was a grad student back at the University of Arizona getting my doctorate in planetary science. And now asteroids are the leftovers of the formation of the solar system. Most of them live out in the main asteroid belt, but a lot of them leak into the inner solar system thanks to Jupiter's gravity. And so the Earth, since it formed 4.5 billion years ago, has been bombarded by these shards, these little shattered remnants of planetary formation. And it does happen periodically on the human lifespan scale. There's really not much to worry about. You and I are unlikely to experience an asteroid catastrophe in our lifetimes, but over 1,000 years or more, we do see that there's going to be, there'll be some kind of an asteroid strike that could be damaging to the planet. So if I can put it in human terms, your odds of dying in an asteroid catastrophe in your lifetime, like they're about 1 in 500,000. It's very small. You're more likely to get hit by lightning or bitten by a shark or some very rare event like that. However, since there are 7 billion of us on the planet, and our society will go on for hundreds of years, there's going to be 100% certainty that Earth is going to be struck in the future. And I think we have the technology now to be able to stop that from happening.
Really? What is the idea? Is it, using, the kind of solar sails and moving the asteroid? What would be the technology that you envision?
Right. We're lucky to have, now a space program for the last 50, 60 years where the technology has matured enough that we have the tools to stop perhaps one of these natural catastrophes. It's the only kind of natural disaster that we can actually think about preventing. We can't stop hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes or tsunamis. We can stop an asteroid if we have enough warning. So there's two parts to the solution. The one is searching and finding asteroids well in advance of when they might strike the Earth. And then the second part of it is developing the technology to send a spacecraft mission out to divert an asteroid from hitting our home planet. And so we have a number of techniques that we can talk about. The simplest is to just run into an asteroid with a high-speed bullet and change its speed enough in its orbit around the sun so that the asteroid misses its appointment with Earth. And there is a more elegant technique called the gravity tractor, where a spacecraft can tug an asteroid in one direction or another and, again, change its velocity, change its appointment with Earth so that it misses the planet completely. And then if we have a severe case where there's a large asteroid or one that's discovered very late in its approach to Earth, we might use the nuclear technology we have available to go out, explode a nuclear explosive next to the asteroid, not inside. That's Hollywood stuff. Just go next to it, fry the surface, and the vapor of the rock that's generated by that nuclear explosion would then shove the rock in the other direction like a big rocket motor. And again, change the speed so that it misses its collision with the Earth. Those are just some of the standard techniques that have been discussed. And we're about to test one next year called the DART mission that NASA is going to launch. It's going to launch in 2021 and actually do the kinetic impact or the high-speed bullet technique, a test on a small asteroid far from Earth.
Wow, that is super awesome. But I remember in Armageddon, they had to blow it up because it was too close to the Earth to divert it. Would that ever be a situation where if an asteroid was so close to the Earth, we would have to actually get on it, or is that pure Hollywood fiction? I mean, what would be the plan if the asteroid was very close and we had missed it earlier?
Yeah, first I'd say that humans are unlikely to be involved except on the ground. So the best way to divert an asteroid is to send a fleet of robots out there. Maybe you'd send multiples of the same spacecraft to make sure that one of them got through and was able to do its job correctly. So no Robert Duvall landing on the surface of the asteroid, or Bruce Willis in Armageddon, doing that. Robert Duvall was in Deep Impact, forgive me.
Yes.
But you might have an appearance of an asteroid that wasn't detected until very late in its collision course with Earth. And then you might have to respond very rapidly with maybe a spacecraft that's on standby in orbit around the Earth, or perhaps you could launch one on short notice from the ground. But the most likely event, let me emphasize this, the most likely event that's going to happen to us in the next 500 years is a collision with a small asteroid that won't do much damage to the ground. And we can probably use civil defense methods to move people out of the danger zone. And if you move them away for a few days, they can come back and re-inhabit that space very quickly, except for the destroyed zone. So, the problem is that there are a lot of small asteroids and only a few big ones. The big ones can end our civilization. The small ones might destroy a city. And so we've got to look for both populations and find out what are the most dangerous threats to Earth. I can tell you that right now there are no asteroids that have been found, and there are over 20,000 that have been discovered in the inner solar system, in the near Earth vicinity. And of those,
How much better are
none
we?
of them are on a collision path with Earth.
How much better over the last 20 years have we gotten at detecting these potential catastrophes? Have our, I remember Billy Bob Thornton said, we only have the budget to look at 3% of the sky. Where are we in terms of the percent of the sky? How would you respond to that, sir?
Sure. Well, finding the asteroids early is the key part of this whole problem solution. And you've got to find them early. That's the most important thing. The second most important thing is to find them early. And the third most important thing in stopping an asteroid strike is to find them early. And so we have NASA funding to the tune of about $150 million a year, a search program for asteroids that might present a threat to the Earth. And since 1998, when that program began, NASA has been very successful. Initially, they found all the big ones, the ones that are bigger than a kilometer in size, about 0.6 of a mile. Those can actually collapse our civilization if they were to run into the Earth. And so we've found 95% of those large objects in the inner solar system. So we don't have to worry too much now about having our civilization go away by surprise. But we haven't found the million or more asteroids in the smaller size categories that could damage a region. I live in Northern Virginia, so you might have an asteroid that could wipe out the entire mid-Atlantic or the state of Arizona, for example. There are about 50,000 of those objects, and we've only found about 30 to 40% of those. Actually, I think that's a high estimate, more like 30%. And then there are the small ones that can destroy a city, and there are a million of those, and we've only gotten 1% of those discovered. So the more there are, the smaller they are, the harder they are to see in a telescope. And so that's why the problem of detecting them is a lot tougher. So NASA has an approach to finding the smaller objects that are still hazardous to us, but that's going to take a couple of decades. And I think the solution to that really is to launch a spacecraft telescope, a space telescope, to look for the smaller asteroids that are out there. And we'll get enough warning time that way that we can develop the spacecraft we need to go out there and nudge them aside.
Is the ISS looking for asteroids? Do we have the capabilities in the ISS, or just we don't have that ability yet?
The ISS is not a great platform. It's too close to the Earth. That means half the sky is obscured by the Earth when you're on the ISS. And so you can't see the entire sky. So for example, one concrete method beyond the ground-based telescopes that are involved in this search for asteroids is to develop a spacecraft called the Near Earth Object Surveyor. That mission would fly a telescope with a mirror about 50 centimeters across, like about this wide. It's only about the size of an SUV, the entire spacecraft. And in 10 years in orbit, that spacecraft could find about 90% of the medium-sized asteroids that threaten us, which is the congressional goal that's been given to NASA. Now, that spacecraft won't go into low Earth orbit where the space station is. It's going to go 1 million miles towards the sun and park with it in an orbit where the Earth becomes very small because of distance, and it doesn't obscure much of the sky. So the new Surveyor telescope would have a much clearer view of the sky. And it's an infrared instrument, which helps to find these small asteroids because they glow with heat, and in fact, brighter than they do with reflected sunlight that we can see with our eyes. So an infrared telescope is the way to find these objects, find out their orbits precisely so we can predict whether they're going to strike the Earth.
Wow. Well, shifting to the positive side of asteroids, my friend Dr. Anita Sengupta has done a lot of work on the potential for harvesting valuable elements from asteroids. Do you have a view on that? Do you think that's something we'll be able to do in the future?
I think it's a great idea, and it's a way to expand our economy into space in a really concrete way, if you'll let me use that term, because the rocks on asteroids are full of valuable resources, from water, which is the lifeblood of space exploration. And if we can find it in space and use it out there, we don't have to haul it up expensively up from the ground. So there are some minerals on a lot of asteroids, even in the near Earth vicinity, that have water locked up in their minerals on the surface. You've heard about the OSIRIS-REx mission that just sampled the asteroid Bennu. Well, that asteroid is thought to have maybe 10% water in its surface rocks, and it's bringing a sample back. And in 2023, we'll have those samples back to determine whether that is an economically viable resource. So water would be the first thing to mine, because you can make rocket fuel from it, oxygen, obviously, and you can drink the water. The second benefit from an asteroid expedition would be, as a byproduct of that water mining, you might find the leftover slag, if you will, would have valuable concentrations of platinum group elements, like platinum and rhodium and osmium. And these are valuable metals that are used in industrial catalysts, like catalytic converters. They're used in lots of chemical processes to speed chemical processes along. And if you can lower the price of platinum, for example, on Earth, that might be something that's worth returning to the planet itself. But for the most part, for the first few decades, water is going to be the big product on mining asteroids, or the moon for that matter.
So something I always ask our astronaut guests is, how scared were you on liftoff using the shuttle? For instance, astronaut Mike Mullane, who actually I was emailing with, and says that you're a brilliant man, and I was in for a treat, which is he's completely correct. Astronaut Mullane said that he was petrified every time he went up in the shuttle, whereas astronaut Ron Guerin felt no fear, and he said he had fear in his F-16, but never in the shuttle. How did you feel, sir?
Well, you can't be an operator or a crew member in a jet like I was in the Air Force, or on the space shuttle, if you don't understand the risks. And I think John Young, who was the first commander of the space shuttle, said, if you don't get a little dry in the mouth when you consider that you're sitting on top of 4 million pounds of explosives, maybe you're in the wrong business. So you've got to think about the physical risk that you're going to take on, yes. But at the moment that you're about to blast off, you can't be paralyzed by fear. You have a job to do. And so you have to realize that somebody else's job was to get this space shuttle ready and to make sure that it's in 100% perfect working condition when the rocket engines ignite. So you have to trust those people to get the rocket ready. You put your physical safety, in fact, your life, in their hands. That's a trust matter that you as an astronaut have to develop with the people who work on the space shuttle or any rocket that you're going to fly. So I would say I was aware of the risk, but I was focused on getting the job done that I'd been paid to do on the mission, from blast off till landing a couple of weeks later. So I can't say I was fearful of the physical experience of blasting off. My anxiety came from wondering whether I was going to be able to do a good job on my first mission up there. You've never been there, you've been trained, but am I trained well enough?
And that's what astronaut Kelly's biggest fear was. Would he be able to succeed as much as his peers and colleagues had expected of him? And so, great.
You don't want to let your team members down, whether they're in mission control, whether they're on the spaceship with you. You don't want to be the reason the team didn't achieve its objectives. And so I can tell you with a lot of satisfaction and appreciation that the NASA instructors that we had and the people in mission control, they did everything they could to get you ready in an amazingly effective way, so that when we did encounter surprises, we were able to transfer that training to solve that new problem.
So the 2003 disaster, do you think the astronauts had any inkling that their tiles were damaged and that they would have an issue on reentry, or were they totally ignorant? Do you have a view on that?
So yeah, the Columbia mission in STS-107 that was lost in February of 2003, they were struck by debris from their external fuel tank during the ride to orbit, and that debris strike fractured a heat resistant panel on their left wing, a heat shield tile, if you will. And so the crew was informed about the fact that they'd been struck by debris, but they were also informed that Mission Control thought there was no issue for them coming back for a safe landing. Turns out that Mission Control, while saying that in good faith, was in error, and they underestimated the catastrophic possibility for a damage like that. And so the crew had been told not to worry about it, and I don't think they had any worries as they began their reentry. Probably, if you read the accident report, Admiral Gaiman's commission that examined the Columbia disaster, they give you a chronology of what happened in the accident sequence. The ship began to go out of control because of damage to the left wing. And at that point, the crew was aware that they had a serious problem. But even though they tried to fly the airplane until the last second, they were powerless to prevent the damage from overcoming the spaceship. And, very shortly after that, the crew was lost consciousness, and, they didn't have much time to feel worried about it at all. That's some comfort to our colleagues and myself.
No. Unlike, there obviously are many hypotheses about Challenger and how long, the astronauts were alive. The air tanks were 7/8 depleted. Judy Resnick, who actually was Mike Mullane's friend in training, she did turn on the astronaut tanks so for Dick Scobie, and so there was some consciousness. Do you have an opinion on that? Do you think that they were? Do you think they lost consciousness immediately as they started falling back, or do you have any?
So the Challenger disaster in 1986 was another terrible tragedy. NASA learned a lot of invaluable lessons about how to prevent a future accident like the booster failure that occurred on the Challenger. And yet, 17 years later, we had another failure that cost us the Columbia, where NASA had forgotten a lot of the corporate lessons there. I've read the Rogers Commission report on the Challenger accident, read books about it. And I can only follow on what those investigations told us. But the astronauts on board the Challenger, they had an accident 70 seconds into the ascent when their right booster rocket failed because of a seal design flaw. And hot rocket exhaust ate its way through the side of the solid rocket motor. That crashed into the fuel tank and caused the destruction of the entire shuttle stack. And the shuttle basically was torn to shreds by going Mach 3 sideways during that ascent at that point. And as you've cited, there's some evidence that the crew took some actions in the cockpit after the orbiter cabin flew out of the fireball. I also think from what I've read that the cabin was breached during that breakup. And so with the air so rarefied at that altitude, upwards of 100,000 feet, they eventually flew up and above 100,000 feet on their ballistic trajectory. Without any atmosphere in the cabin, they had no capability to keep conscious. So even though the air packs were activated, that wasn't a pressurized pressure suit that would preserve their consciousness or allow them to work. So they very quickly, within 10 seconds, I would say, lost consciousness. And then unfortunately, the crew had no way to survive the impact with the water.
No way whatsoever.
Tens of seconds later, it was a couple of minutes later before the cabin hit the water. So they were doomed from the moment the shuttle broke up. And that was generally true with the shuttle in its entire 30-year history. If your orbiter, your space plane, did not come back in one piece, you were not going to make it either. So you needed that intact orbiter to come back to a landing or even to try a bailout. And in either case, Challenger or Columbia, did you have that?
You had a quarter million tons. You had miles of wires. This was heavy, sophisticated, the most sophisticated, if you will, rig that has ever been created. The space shuttle really, it took, you talk about John Young, and when he got out on the desert after the maiden flight, that was an inspiration to myself, my brothers, my family, and all of America. And so I think that the space shuttle continues to be an inspiration to Americans for potential innovation. And that's why Challenger is so exciting, and not exciting in a bad way, but it motivates the intellectual curiosity to understand what mistakes humans made so that we can create a better world, a smarter world, a safer world. So, I guess that's part of my fascination with it. Reverting back to the takeoff, the actual G-shock that you experienced, was that as legendary as they say? Was there anything else that you'd ever felt like it?
No, I never felt anything else in the flying business like that. And you're prepared for the jolt of liftoff from the simulator sessions that you have, and I wrote a centrifuge to get ready for the G accelerations, but they don't really replicate the actual launch sequence very well. You know that there's a sequence of events 6 seconds before liftoff, the main engines would fire up. And so now you're sitting in a skyscraper that's rumbling like it's an earthquake. And then as those engines come up to full thrust in 6 seconds, by the time the clock reaches 0, they're at full thrust. If the computers give them the blessing that we're ready to go and they're functioning properly, then the computers ignite the booster rockets. And when that happens, it's as if somebody has propelled your chair all the way to the ceiling with just a giant kick in the back. And so you're thrust upwards and backwards and forwards and sideways all at the same time with this tremendous jolt. And it's like an auditory bang coming through your helmet. And there's also this giant jolt. And then you immediately start shaking with the thrust and the power of those two solid rocket motors that are generating over 6 million pounds of liftoff thrust. So there's no way to simulate or prepare you for that. That's just going to be an eye boggler. You're going to just try to grab your brain back from behind you where it got left behind.
Did you close your eyes? What did you do personally? Did you close your eyes? How did you deal with the most intense part of the shock?
It's not something that's going to be painful, and you'll get jolted through it. Okay. You have a job to do, so you can't afford to close your eyes. I was the flight engineer on my third mission on Columbia, and my job was to call out the software transitioning from ground mode to ascent mode. It's a very vital thing that has to happen. So, I had to coordinate with the pilots on making that call, making sure they were taking the actions right off the launch pad that they were supposed to do. So, you've got to stay focused throughout all that jolting and vibration. And so that's why, astronauts train in the T-38 Talon jets back in Houston, so that you have that experience in an aviation environment of what an afterburner light is and what a hard landing is and what turbulence is in a thunderstorm. You've got to have that experience in your pocket so that you can work your way through this brand new physical experience of launch.
Oh, no, awesome. Reverting back to Gus Grissom, why do you think he blew the door in the ocean? Do you think he just had a panic attack? Was there a fundamental reason for why this extraordinarily well-trained astronaut would make such a mistake? I'm sorry to bring it up. It's been something I've been curious about since I first read Tom Wolfe's, The Right Stuff back almost 40 years ago now.
Hey, Gus Grissom is one of the astronauts I admired as a kid growing up. He died in the 1967 Apollo 1 fire. Gus was one of the sharpest astronauts that NASA had in the 60s. He was selected for the Mercury program, flew the second suborbital shot on Mercury with his Liberty Bell 7 capsule. And then he was selected to fly the very first Gemini mission. So NASA thought very highly of him and his skills. And so I would correct the historical record. Tom Wolfe is not a historian. He was a novelist. And he took a lot of liberties with Gus Grissom's career in that book. The Mercury astronauts and their spouses that I met were not happy with Tom Wolfe's portrayal, even though I think it was a great story and I love the movie and I'm watching the TV series, The Right Stuff, right now. It's a very good drama. But Gus got smeared by Tom Wolfe in that book. And so there was an accident investigation after his capsule sank. And Wally Schirra pointed out that, in order for him to accidentally jettison the hatch, he would have had to hit a plunger with his left hand in the cabin there to fire the explosive bolts that blow that hatch off. And when you do that, the pyrotechnic chain pushes that plunger back at you very rapidly and slaps your hand with enough force to bruise your palm. And Wally Schirra had gone through this test of that plunger and had a big black and blue mark on his palm for a couple of weeks afterwards. And when Gus got back, there was no such bruise. And so the likely cause of that failure or of the hatch blowing off inadvertently was probably a static electricity buildup. The system wasn't grounded properly. And so those pyrotechnics fired after splashdown. So it wasn't Gus's fault. NASA believed that. And he was assigned to fly the first Gemini mission in 1965.
Wow, fascinating. You just corrected an entire life's belief that I've had. Unbelievable.
Read a book called Lost Spacecraft about the recovery of Liberty Bell 7.
Lost Spacecraft?
Lost Spacecraft. It's a really good book about that mission and, of course, the spacecraft recovery from the bottom of the ocean. But in the course of it, you'll learn about Gus's role.
Sadly, Tom Wolfe has passed away, but we had his daughter on to discuss the book a few months ago. But I'd love to read about Lost Mission, and maybe we can get the author on. This has just been such an awesome experience. I couldn't be more thankful, and all of our viewers will be extremely thankful. And I, I, I wish you total safety in these crazy times, Astronaut Jones. This is
All right.
super fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Check out my website. It's astronauttomjones.com, and read my memoir called Skywalking: An Astronaut's Memoir. I recommend it.
Well, no, I mean, you've got a few books out though. I mean, not just your memoir. You've written, I think it's 3 books now.
I think 6 altogether. My last
Wow,
one
6.
was called
Okay.
Ask the Astronaut, a galaxy of astonishing answers to your questions about spaceflight. 343 questions and answers about spaceflight. And if you're going to go up as a tourist, you might want to read this book before you go. So check out Ask the Astronaut as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, you are a living legend. It's what I was told by everyone I'm friends with at NASA before you came on. I was super excited to have you on, and I must say you absolutely lived up to your legend, Astronaut. Thank you so much, and humble graciousness from both of us.
I was glad to have the conversation with you. Thanks a lot.